World War II is remembered through massive tank battles, carrier duels, and million-man offensives. But parallel to these titanic clashes, another war unfolded in the shadows. Small teams of elite soldiers operated behind enemy lines, destroying infrastructure, gathering intelligence, and killing with precision. They were outnumbered 1,000 to 1, yet their actions often had strategic consequences far beyond their size. These were the Special Forces, a new breed of warrior invented during the war itself. Before 1940, no major military had fielded dedicated units for unconventional warfare. By 1945, every combatant nation had created teams trained to operate where conventional armies could not. Which country fielded the most effective special forces? To answer that question, we need clear definitions and measurable standards. We'll judge based on 5 criteria: strategic impact, tactical innovation and versatility, training and selection quality, cost-effectiveness and resourcefulness, and legacy and influence on modern warfare. 4 major contenders emerge: the United Kingdom, the German Reich, the United States, and the Soviet Union. We'll also examine 2 specialist forces, Italy and Finland, whose niche innovations changed naval and Arctic warfare forever. The Shadow War begins. While millions died in conventional battles across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, hundreds of elite operators fought a parallel war that received little attention but often had outsized consequences. They slipped through enemy lines at night, planted explosives on critical infrastructure, gathered intelligence that shaped major offensives, and vanished before reinforcements arrived. Their missions bypassed conventional defenses entirely. The concept itself was new. Elite infantry units had existed for centuries: guards, regiments, grenadiers, shock troops. But these fought on the front line in traditional roles. Special forces were fundamentally different. They conducted missions conventional armies could not: sabotage deep behind enemy lines, organized civilian resistance movements, maritime raids against fortified harbors, and reconnaissance in enemy-held territory where discovery meant certain death. Before we can rank which nation fielded the most effective special forces, we must establish what separates them from elite infantry and what makes them effective. The line can blur, but 4 attributes define a true special force in the World War II context. First, mission type. Special forces conduct unconventional operations. They don't hold a front line or advance with armored columns. Instead, they sabotage factories, gather intelligence, conduct raids, or lead guerrilla movements. Their missions bypass the main battle entirely. Second, operational location. Special forces work behind enemy lines or in capacities that avoid conventional engagement. A commando team destroying a bridge in occupied France operates fundamentally differently from an infantry battalion storming a beach. Third, selection. Special forces are volunteers who pass selection processes far more rigorous than regular military training. Not every soldier can become a commando or paratrooper. The washout rates are extreme, and only the most physically capable, mentally resilient, and motivated individuals make it through. Fourth, size and structure. Special forces operate in small units, teams of 4 to 10 men, sometimes larger assault groups of 50 to 100, but never as divisions. Independence is key. These teams often work without direct command oversight for days or weeks. 5 criteria will guide our judgment of effectiveness. Strategic impact asks whether their actions had disproportionate effects on the wider war. Did destroying a single factory cripple an entire weapons program? Did a raid divert thousands of enemy troops? Did the intelligence gathered change the outcome of a major battle? Tactical innovation and versatility measure whether they pioneered new methods, technologies, or tactics. Could they adapt to multiple environments: desert, jungle, Arctic, urban? Did they invent techniques still used today? Training and selection examine the rigor of their preparation. How brutal was the selection? How specialized was the training? Did it create soldiers genuinely superior for unconventional tasks? Cost-effectiveness and resourcefulness. Look at return on investment. Did they achieve results with minimal men and materiel? How resourceful were they when isolated behind enemy lines? Legacy and influence. Consider whether their organizations, tactics, and ethos directly shaped modern special forces. Do today's units trace their lineage back to these World War II originals? These 5 pillars: strategic impact, innovation, training, cost-effectiveness, and legacy will determine the ranking. No subjective bias, just measurable performance against clear standards. The Contenders step forward. 4 nations fielded special forces capable of global-scale operations: the United Kingdom, the German Reich, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Each approached unconventional warfare differently, reflecting their strategic situations, military cultures, and resources. Britain entered the war with no special forces at all. After the disaster at Dunkirk in 1940, Winston Churchill demanded the creation of raiding units to strike back at occupied Europe. Desperation forced innovation. Britain invented the modern commando, the Special Air Service, and the Special Operations Executive. These organizations became the blueprint for Western special operations. Germany began the war with tactical brilliance. The Brandenburgers specialized in deception and disguise, seizing objectives before the enemy could react. The Fallschirmjäger pioneered airborne assault with operations that stunned the world. Otto Skorzeny's SS Commandos conducted high-risk rescues and raids, but German special forces suffered from misuse and attritional losses that squandered their potential. The United States came late to special operations, creating the Office of Strategic Services and the Army Rangers in 1942. They modeled their units directly on British examples, sending volunteers to train at British facilities. American special forces had a brutal learning curve, suffering catastrophic failures alongside heroic successes. They were perfecting the art during the war, not arriving with it mastered. The Soviet Union fielded a special operations model unlike any other. The NKVD's Special Tasks units combined intelligence operatives, assassins, and organizers of mass partisan warfare. They didn't focus on surgical precision. Instead, they directed hundreds of thousands of irregular fighters in coordinated sabotage campaigns that crippled German logistics across entire fronts. Beyond the Big Four, 2 specialist forces warrant attention. Italy's Decima Flottiglia MAS pioneered naval special warfare with frogmen and human torpedoes. Finland's Sissi units mastered Arctic reconnaissance and ambush tactics. These smaller forces didn't win the war, but their innovations influenced every navy and cold weather military that followed. We'll rank these forces from 4th to 1st as we analyze them, revealing why each placed where it did. Some rankings will be uncontroversial, others will challenge conventional wisdom, but the evidence will guide us, not assumptions. Britain's story begins with desperation. Britain, forged in desperation. In May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force evacuated from Dunkirk, abandoning France to Nazi occupation. Britain stood alone, its army shattered, invasion imminent. Winston Churchill penned a memo demanding specially trained troops of the Hunter class who can develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast. He wanted raiders men who could strike occupied Europe and vanish before the enemy could react. Britain had no existing units for this mission. Everything had to be invented from scratch. By June 1940, the first commando units formed, drawing volunteers from every branch of the British military. The name itself came from Boer War irregular fighters, now repurposed for amphibious raids. Commando training took place at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands. Volunteers arrived at the local train station and faced an immediate test. March 8 miles to the castle in under 60 minutes, carrying full gear. Those who failed were immediately returned to unit RTU'd in commando slang. The course itself was brutal. Live ammunition filled every exercise. Instructors threw grenades into trenches to force trainees to react under genuine danger. Amphibious landings, demolitions, close-quarters combat, and extreme physical conditioning filled every day. The washout rate was high. Only the toughest and most motivated completed the course. Achnacarry became the gold standard for special forces training. American Rangers, Free French Commandos, and Norwegian resistance fighters trained there. The methods developed in that Scottish castle would shape Western Special Forces doctrine for decades. The operation that defined commando effectiveness came in March 1942. Operation Chariot, the raid on Saint-Nazaire. The German battleship Tirpitz posed an existential threat to Allied convoys in the Atlantic. As a fleet in being, its mere presence tied down massive Royal Navy resources. If Tirpitz sortied into the Atlantic, it could devastate convoy routes. But Tirpitz needed a dry dock capable of servicing its massive hull. Only one such dock existed on the Atlantic coast, the Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire, France. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. An obsolete destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, would be packed with 4.5 tons of delayed-action explosives. Disguised as a German destroyer, it would ram the dock gates. Commandos aboard the Campbelltown and accompanying motor launches would then swarm ashore, destroying the dock's pumping machinery and gates. On the night of March 27, 1942, the force sailed up the Loire estuary using captured German naval codes. The deception worked initially, but eventually broke. Searchlights illuminated the flotilla. Coastal guns opened fire. The Campbelltown accelerated through the storm of fire and struck the dock gate, embedding itself deep into the structure. Commandos poured ashore. For the next hour, teams moved methodically through the dockyard, placing demolition charges on 24 separate targets. German troops counterattacked. The fighting was vicious and chaotic. The cost was horrific. Of the 612 sailors and commandos on the raid, 169 were killed, and 215 became prisoners of war. Most motor launches were destroyed, but the mission succeeded. The next morning, the Campbelltown detonated, killing over 360 Germans and French civilians and completely obliterating the Normandy dock. The Tirpitz never had its Atlantic port. It was forced to hide in Norwegian fjords, where RAF bombers eventually sank it in November 1944. Operation Chariot is the perfect example of strategic impact. The loss of a single obsolete destroyer and several hundred elite troops permanently altered the naval balance in the Atlantic. The raid received 5 Victoria Crosses, the most for any single action in the entire war. While Commandos pioneered amphibious raiding, another British unit revolutionized desert warfare, the Special Air Service. In 1941, a young officer named David Stirling conceived a radical idea. He believed small teams of 4 to 5 men, parachuted deep into the desert, could destroy more enemy aircraft on the ground than the entire Royal Air Force could in the air. He bypassed normal chains of command and convinced skeptical generals to give him a chance. His unit was dubbed L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, a complete deception to make German intelligence believe Britain had a full airborne brigade in North Africa. The SAS's first parachute operation was a disaster, with only 22 of 65 men returning. But Stirling adapted. He partnered with the Long Range Desert Group, which became the SAS's desert taxi service, and acquired American Willys Jeeps. Stirling's men stripped them down and mounted batteries of forward-firing Vickers K and .50 caliber machine guns. These armed jeeps became the template for all modern special operations vehicles. One of the most famous raids targeted Sidi Hanesh Airfield in July 1942. 18 SAS jeeps drove in 2 columns down the main runway, guns blazing with tracers, destroying 37 Luftwaffe aircraft in minutes. Only 2 SAS men were killed. Over the course of the North African campaign, the SAS destroyed an estimated 400 Axis aircraft on the ground. That figure exceeded the kills of entire RAF squadrons. The impact on Rommel's air support and supply lines was devastating. Every armed vehicle used by special forces today traces its concept back to Stirling's jeeps in the desert. While Commandos raided and the SAS struck airfields, a third British organization fought an even quieter war: the Special Operations Executive. The SOE was not a military unit. It was a separate organization tasked with espionage, sabotage, and organizing resistance movements across occupied Europe. Churchill's directive was simple: set Europe ablaze. End. The SOE's greatest operation took place in Norway in February 1943, Operation Gunnerside. The Norsk hydro plant at Vemork was the only facility in the world producing heavy water in industrial quantities. Heavy water was a key component for German atomic bomb research. If Germany succeeded in building a nuclear weapon, the war would be lost. An earlier British glider attempt had failed catastrophically, with survivors captured and executed. The Germans increased security, making a frontal assault impossible. The SOE sent 6 Norwegian commandos who parachuted into Norway and linked up with a 4-man advance team. This 10-man team skied across frozen wilderness. When they reached Vemork, they faced a heavily guarded plant perched on a cliff edge above a deep gorge. The team climbed the 500-foot gorge in darkness, infiltrated the plant, and placed explosive charges directly on the heavy water concentration cells. Not a single shot was fired. The guards never knew they were there. The team escaped on skis. The charges detonated, wrecking the plant. The Germans eventually decided to move their remaining heavy water stocks to Germany. The SOE learned of this plan. A Norwegian resistance agent planted a bomb on the transport ferry, Hydro. On February 20th, 1944, the ferry sank in Lake Tinn, taking the last of Germany's heavy water to the bottom. 10 men, with explosives and skis, denied Hitler the atomic bomb. This is arguably the single greatest strategic victory by a special forces unit in history. If Germany had developed nuclear weapons, the outcome of the war could have been radically different. Britain's special forces checked every box. The Commandos invented the modern raid. The SAS pioneered vehicle-mounted desert warfare and proved small teams could achieve massive results. The SOE demonstrated that organizing resistance movements could turn occupied nations into second fronts. Their strategic impact, tactical innovation, training standards, cost-effectiveness, and legacy are unmatched. Across the English Channel, Germany was developing its own unconventional units, and in the war's early years, they were devastatingly effective. Germany. Brilliance, Squandered. Germany entered World War II with tactical brilliance and a willingness to experiment with radical new concepts. While Britain scrambled to invent special forces after Dunkirk, Germany had already fielded units designed for unconventional warfare. Their early successes were spectacular. Their later decline was a tragedy of mismanagement. The Brandenburgers were Germany's original special force, formed by the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. Their concept was simple but devastating: use deception to seize critical objectives before the enemy could react. The Brandenburgers recruited ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, who had lived abroad and spoke foreign languages fluently. They were trained in disguise, silent killing, demolitions, and independent operations. Their job was to infiltrate enemy territory, often wearing enemy uniforms or civilian clothes, and secure bridges, railroads, or communication hubs before conventional forces arrived. During the invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940, the Brandenburgers demonstrated their potential at Gennep. An 8-man team disguised themselves as German deserters, being escorted by 2 men in Dutch military police uniforms. They walked onto the bridge over the Maas River, shot the guards, and disarmed the demolition charges. A German armored train and troop transports crossed immediately, unhinging the Dutch Peel-Ram defensive line and allowing panzer columns to pour into the Netherlands. The Brandenburgers were masters of the coup de main, the sudden, decisive strike that exploited surprise and deception. In the war's early years, they operated across Europe and North Africa, seizing objectives with minimal losses. But their decline began when they were pulled from Abwehr control and used as elite frontline infantry on the Eastern Front. This was a catastrophic waste of their unique skills. Instead of conducting surgical deception operations, they were fed into the meat grinder of conventional combat. By the war's end, the Brandenburgers were a shadow of their former selves. Germany's most spectacular special forces operation came from the Fallschirmjäger, or paratroopers. Fort Eben-Emael was considered the strongest fortress in the world. Located in Belgium, its massive guns dominated the bridges over the Albert Canal, the key to Belgian defenses. A conventional attack would take weeks and cost thousands of lives. Germany planned something no one had ever attempted. A small 85-man unit called Sturmabteilung Koch would land on top of the fortress using 11 DFS-230 gliders. Gliders were chosen for their silent, pinpoint-accurate approach. The assault force carried a new weapon, hollow charge explosives. These shaped charges could focus their blast to penetrate thick concrete and steel. At dawn on May 10, 1940, the gliders landed silently on the fortress roof. Fallschirmjäger teams raced to their objectives, placing hollow charges on gun turrets and observation domes. The charges detonated, blowing apart the fortress's defenses. In less than 30 minutes, the impregnable fortress was neutralized. By the next day, Fort Eben-Emael had surrendered. The Albert Canal bridges were seized intact, and panzer columns rolled into Belgium. Operation Eben-Emael is arguably a perfect operation. 85 men, using innovative tactics and new technology, neutralized a fortress that should have held for weeks. The strategic impact was immense. The entire Belgian front was unlocked. The French and British armies, rushing to Belgium, were caught out of position. The German advance into France accelerated, but the Fallschirmjägers' success contained the seeds of their decline. Germany attempted a large-scale airborne invasion of Crete in May 1941. The operation succeeded, but at a catastrophic cost. German paratroopers suffered over 6,000 casualties, including nearly 2,000 killed. Hitler, shaken by the losses, forbade all future large-scale airborne operations. The Fallschirmjäger were never again used in their intended role. Like the Brandenburgers, they were converted into elite infantry and fed into conventional battles. Germany's third major special forces organization was Otto Skorzény's SS Sonderverband Z. B. V. Friedenthal. Skorzeny was an ambitious, scar-faced SS officer who specialized in high-risk, high-propaganda operations. His unit conducted raids, rescues, and deception missions directly for Hitler. His most famous mission came in September 1943, the rescue of Benito Mussolini from Gran Sasso. Italy had surrendered, and Mussolini was arrested. He was being held at the Hotel Campo Imperatore, a mountaintop resort accessible only by a single funicular cable car. Hitler demanded Mussolini's rescue. Skorzeny and his men would land in gliders on the tiny, rocky plateaus around the hotel itself, a landing most pilots considered suicidal. On September 12, 1943, the gliders crash-landed on the mountain. Skorzeny and his men stormed the hotel. The Italian guards, stunned and demoralized, surrendered without firing a shot. Mussolini was rescued in minutes. The raid was a massive propaganda victory for Germany. But the strategic value was minimal. Mussolini was installed as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic, a rump state with no real power. The rescue changed nothing about Italy's collapse. Skorzeny conducted other operations, including Operation Greif during the Battle of the Bulge, where his men wore American uniforms to sow confusion. These operations were tactically daring, but their impact was more psychological than strategic. Germany's special forces trajectory is clear. In the war's opening years, they achieved spectacular results. The Brandenburgers seized key objectives through deception. The Fallschirmjäger cracked the world's strongest fortress. These were tactical masterpieces, but Germany failed to sustain that effectiveness. The Brandenburgers were wasted as line infantry. The Fallschirmjäger were decimated at Crete and never used as airborne troops again. Skorzeny's operations prioritized propaganda over strategy. Germany had the best operators but the worst management. Their potential was squandered by commanders who either misunderstood special forces or refused to accept the casualties necessary for their proper employment. Their organizations, the SS, the Abwehr, were dissolved after the war. Their tactics were studied, but their institutional legacy died. Germany ranks third. Their tactical innovation was exceptional, their training was world-class, but their strategic failures and inability to sustain effectiveness cost them a higher placement. Two smaller nations fielded units that, within their narrow domains, achieved results rivaling the Big Four. The specialists. Precision personified. Not every effective special force came from a major power. Two smaller nations fielded units that, within their narrow domains, achieved results rivaling the Big Four. Italy pioneered naval special warfare. Finland mastered Arctic reconnaissance. Their contributions were niche, but their influence on modern special operations is undeniable. Italy's Decima Flotilla Mas, the 10th Light Flotilla, were the pioneers of naval special warfare. They were elite frogmen and human torpedo operators who proved that a handful of men could shift the balance of naval power. Their key weapon was the Siluro, a lenta corsa, or slow-running torpedo, nicknamed the maiale, pig. This was a human-guided torpedo. Two frogmen, wearing oxygen rebreathers that released no telltale bubbles, would ride the torpedo submerged into an enemy harbor. They would navigate through minefields, nets, and patrols, detach the warhead, clamp it to a ship's keel, set the timer, and escape. The technology itself was revolutionary. Oxygen rebreathers had never been used in combat before. Unlike standard diving equipment that released air bubbles to the surface, visible even at night, the rebreather recycled exhaled air through a chemical scrubber that removed carbon dioxide. The diver remained completely invisible underwater. The maiale itself was electrically powered, moving at roughly 2.5 knots. It was slow but silent. The warhead carried 300 kilograms of high explosive, enough to break a battleship's keel. Navigation was the hardest part. Frogmen had to guide the torpedo for hours through dark, cold water, using only a compass and their knowledge of harbor layouts memorized from reconnaissance photographs. They had to avoid patrol boats, listening posts, and anti-submarine nets. Any mistake meant capture or death. The tactics required extreme courage and technical skill. Frogmen trained for months in cold water endurance, underwater navigation, and explosive placement. They practiced attacking mock-ups of enemy ships until they could complete the mission blind. The selection process was brutal. Only the most physically fit, mentally resilient, and technically proficient made it through. On the night of December 18, 1941, the Decima MAS launched their most audacious operation, the raid on Alexandria Harbor, Egypt, the main base of the British Mediterranean Fleet. 3 maiale teams, 6 men total, were launched from the submarine Sirè outside the harbor. Lieutenant Luigi Durand de la Penne and his crewman Emilio Bianchi targeted HMS Valiant. Captain Antonio Marseglia and Spartaco Shergat targeted HMS Queen Elizabeth. Lieutenant Vincenzo Martellotta and Mario Marino targeted a tanker and a destroyer. They navigated the defenses for hours, submerged in freezing water, guiding their torpedoes past patrol boats and anti-submarine nets. The cold was numbing. The oxygen rebreathers had to be monitored constantly for malfunction. One leak, one moment of panic, and they would drown. De la Penne's maiale suffered mechanical problems. It sank beneath HMS Valiant before he could properly position it. He and Bianchi dove repeatedly, trying to move the warhead into optimal position, but eventually ran out of time and strength. They surfaced, were captured, and refused to talk. De la Penne was locked in a compartment aboard Valiant itself. 15 minutes before the charge was set to detonate, he warned the British captain, saving lives but refusing to reveal details that might help defuse the bomb. Each team found its target. 2 British battleships, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, had limpet mines attached to their keels. The frogmen set the timers and attempted to escape. All 6 were eventually captured. Hours later, just after dawn, the bombs detonated. Both battleships were crippled, sinking at their moorings. The explosions blew massive holes in their hulls. Water poured into engine rooms and magazines. Both ships settled onto the harbor bottom, their superstructures still visible above water but completely out of action. The tanker Sagona was also sunk. In one night, 6 Italians shifted the entire naval balance of power in the Mediterranean. The British fleet commander, Admiral Cunningham, later wrote that his fleet would have to leave it to the Royal Air Force to try if they could defend convoys, because his capital ships were out of action. Queen Elizabeth required 14 months of repairs. Valiant was out for 6 months. For cost-effectiveness and tactical innovation, the Decima MAS is arguably unmatched. 6 men captured for 2 battleships disabled. No operation in the war achieved a better return on investment. The Decima MAS conducted other operations throughout the war. In September 1940, they attacked Gibraltar, damaging several ships. In May 1941, they sank the cruiser HMS York in Crete's Suda Bay. Their techniques, human torpedoes, limpet mines, oxygen rebreathers, were studied and copied by every major navy. After the war, their legacy was immediate and direct. The British formed the Special Boat Service in part based on Italian frogman tactics. The US Navy created underwater demolition teams, precursors to the SEALs, using Italian methods. Israeli naval commandos studied Decima MAS operations extensively. Modern combat diving, naval special warfare, and ship sabotage all trace their lineage back to the Italian frogmen of World War II. While Italy mastered the sea, Finland mastered the Arctic. Finland's Sissi units were long-range reconnaissance patrols trained to operate in the deep forests and frozen wilderness of the Finnish-Soviet border. They were not irregular partisans. They were highly trained light infantry of the regular Finnish defense forces. The name Sissi came from a Finnish word for guerrilla fighters, but these were professional soldiers. Selection emphasized men who grew up in rural Finland, who knew forests and winter survival instinctively. Training focused on cross-country skiing, wilderness navigation, camouflage, silent movement, and small unit tactics. Sissi units operated on skis, moving silently through terrain that would immobilize conventional forces. They conducted reconnaissance deep in Soviet-held territory, ambushed supply convoys, and pioneered Motti tactics, the Finnish word for an encircled enemy unit. The tactic involved cutting off Soviet columns on forest roads, surrounding them and destroying them piecemeal. One classic Motti operation occurred during the Winter War at Rate Road in January 1940. A Soviet division, the 44th Rifle Division, advanced along a narrow forest road. Finnish forces, including Sissi reconnaissance units, encircled them. The Soviets, trapped on the road with no room to maneuver, were cut into smaller pockets. Finnish ski troops attacked each pocket separately. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Soviet troops, poorly equipped for winter, froze in their positions. The entire division was destroyed. Over 7,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. The Finns captured 27 tanks, over 50 artillery pieces, and hundreds of vehicles. Sissi's tactics were brutally effective because they exploited terrain and climate as weapons. Soviet forces, trained for conventional warfare on open ground, were helpless in dense forests against an enemy that appeared from nowhere, struck, and vanished. Conventional Soviet advantages, tanks, artillery, aircraft meant nothing in terrain, where roads were death traps and visibility was measured in meters. During the Winter War of 1939 to 1940 and the Continuation War of 1941 to 1944, Sissi units repeatedly demonstrated the effectiveness of soldiers trained to use their native terrain as a weapon. Soviet forces, unfamiliar with the environment and poorly equipped for winter, suffered catastrophic losses to Finnish ski troops who appeared, struck, and vanished into the forests. The Sissi proved that long-range reconnaissance and wilderness survival were as critical as firepower. Their tactics influenced cold-weather special operations forces worldwide. After the war, NATO militaries studied Finnish winter warfare extensively. Modern units operating in Arctic environments, Norwegian Special Forces, Canadian Joint Task Force 2, US, Army Mountain Rangers, and Swedish Special Operations Group all employ principles the Sissi pioneered. Mobility on skis or snowshoes, camouflage in winter terrain, small unit independence, and the ability to survive and fight in extreme cold for extended periods. The Finnish concept of using terrain itself as a force multiplier became a foundational doctrine for special operations in restrictive environments. Whether jungle, mountain, desert, or Arctic, modern special forces train to exploit terrain advantages the way the Sissi did in the frozen forests of Karelia. Italy and Finland didn't field global-scale special forces, but within their domains, they were unmatched. The Decima MAS achieved the best cost-effectiveness ratio of the war. The Sissi demonstrated terrain mastery and created the template for Arctic warfare. Both units left legacies that modern special forces still study. Their innovations proved that specialization, when perfected, could rival the effectiveness of larger, more versatile forces. The United States, a latecomer to special operations, brought industrial power and raw determination to the fight. America. The learning curve. The United States entered World War II with no special forces tradition. When the Office of Strategic Services and the Army Rangers were formed in 1942, they were built from scratch, modeling themselves directly on British examples. American volunteers were even sent to Achnacarry Castle in Scotland to train alongside British commandos. The US approach to special operations reflected the nation's broader war strategy. Learn quickly, apply overwhelming resources, and accept mistakes as the price of progress. American special forces had a brutal learning curve. Their failures were catastrophic. Their successes were heroic. By the war's end, they had created organizations that would define American military power for the next 80 years. The U.S. Army Rangers were activated in June 1942 under the command of Major William O. Darby. The 1st Battalion, known as Darby's Rangers, drew volunteers from units across the U.S. Army. The training was brutal, modeled on the British Commando course, emphasizing extreme fitness, amphibious landings, demolitions, and close-quarters combat. Rangers participated in the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, but their defining moment came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Point du Hoc was a 100-foot sheer cliff on the Normandy coast. On top were 6 155mm coastal guns that could rain fire on both Utah and Omaha beaches. If those guns were operational during the landings, thousands of American soldiers would die. The 2nd Ranger Battalion's mission was to scale the cliffs under fire and destroy the guns. The Rangers launched from landing craft under heavy German fire using rocket-fired grappling hooks and extension ladders. German defenders fired machine guns and dropped grenades on them. Despite the chaos, the Rangers secured the battery. When they searched the gun emplacements, they found the guns had been moved. Ranger patrols pushed inland and found the guns hidden in an orchard 1 kilometer away. They destroyed them with thermite grenades. The cost was high. Of the 225 Rangers who assaulted Point du Hoc, only 90 were still combat effective by the end of D-Day. But the guns were neutralized, and thousands of lives were saved on the landing beaches. Point du Hoc is one of the most heroic small unit actions of the war. It was a coup de main that achieved exactly what it was supposed to. But 6 months earlier, the Rangers had suffered their worst disaster. In January 1944, during the Anzio landings in Italy, Darby's 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions were ordered to infiltrate German lines at night and seize the town of Cisterna. The mission was poorly conceived. This was a task for a battalion, not a special force. It was a conventional attack with no support, no armor, and no fallback plan. The Germans were waiting. At dawn on January 30th, the two Ranger battalions, 767 men, were caught in the open, surrounded by German tanks, self-propelled guns, and panzer grenadiers. By the end of the day, the battle was over. Of the 767 Rangers, 761 were killed or captured. Only 6 men made it back to Allied lines. Cisterna is the ultimate cautionary tale. It demonstrates what happens when conventional commanders misuse special forces. The Rangers were effective when used correctly, as at Pointe du Hoc. They were annihilated when mismanaged, as at Cisterna. The lesson was clear. Special forces are not simply better infantry. They are precision tools designed for specific missions. Using them in conventional roles is catastrophic. While the Rangers learned hard lessons in Europe, another American organization was perfecting the art of force multiplication, the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS, Force Multiplication, the Office of Strategic Services, was the American equivalent of Britain's SOE, created in June 1942 under the leadership of Wild Bill Donovan. It was a hybrid organization, part intelligence agency, part special operations force. After the war, the OSS would split into the CIA and the U.S. Army Special Forces, but during the war, it combined espionage, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare into a single mission. The OSS was organized into 3 main branches. Secret intelligence conducted classic espionage. Special operations handled sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Operational groups were uniform, 30-man military units, often composed of men from specific ethnic backgrounds, Greek Americans, Italian Americans, deployed to work in their ancestral homelands. The genius of the OSS model was integration. Intelligence operatives gathered information. Special operations agents acted on that information. Operational groups provided the muscle when needed. The organization could shift fluidly between pure espionage and direct military action. The OSS's greatest contribution to special operations came in the form of the Jedburgh teams. Jedburghs were 3-man teams composed of 1 American, 1 British, and 1 French officer, plus a radio operator. Their mission was to parachute into occupied France ahead of D-Day, link up with the French resistance, the Maquis, and organize them into effective fighting forces. 93 Jedburgh teams dropped into France between June and September 1944. Their impact was disproportionate to their size. A single 3-man team could coordinate the actions of thousands of resistance fighters. They trained the Maquis in demolitions, ambush tactics, and communication. They coordinated airdrops of weapons and supplies. Most importantly, they synchronized resistance actions with Allied strategy. The Jedburgh's strategic impact was immense. On D-Day, the Maquis, organized and directed by Jedburgh teams, cut 950 rail lines across France. This rail plan crippled German logistics at the exact moment reinforcements were desperately needed in Normandy. One of the most significant Jedburgh successes involved delaying the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. This elite armored division was stationed in southern France when D-Day began. It should have reached Normandy in 3 days. Instead, Jedburgh-led Maquis harassed it constantly, blowing bridges, ambushing convoys, cutting rail lines. The journey took 17 days. By the time Das Reich arrived in Normandy, the Allies had solidified their beachhead. The delay may have prevented the Germans from throwing the invasion back into the sea. The Jedburghs are a prime example of strategic impact and cost-effectiveness. A few hundred men organized a ghost army that tied down massive German resources and created a second front inside France itself. Their legacy is the core doctrine of the U.S. Army Special Forces, De oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. The Green Berets' mission of training and leading foreign irregular forces traces directly back to the Jedburgh model. Beyond France, the OSS operated in Italy, Yugoslavia, Greece, Burma, and China. In Burma, OSS Detachment 101 worked with Kachin guerrillas against Japanese forces, conducting reconnaissance and ambush operations. In Italy, OSS operational groups parachuted behind German lines to organize partisan attacks on supply routes. In Greece, they coordinated resistance movements that tied down entire German divisions. The OSS's operational diversity was its strength. While the SAS specialized in vehicle raids and the Commandos specialized in amphibious assaults, the OSS could do everything: intelligence collection, demolitions, guerrilla organization, propaganda, and direct action. This versatility came at a cost. The OSS never achieved the same level of tactical excellence as more specialized units. But what they lacked in surgical precision, they made up for in strategic breadth. The OSS's legacy is impossible to overstate. After the war, its intelligence apparatus became the Central Intelligence Agency. Its military operations branch evolved into the U.S. Army Special Forces. The Jedburgh model of working by, with, and through indigenous forces became the cornerstone of American unconventional warfare doctrine. Every Green Beret team deployed to train Afghan fighters or Colombian anti-narcotics units is executing a mission template written by the OSS in 1944. The United States brought industrial power and organizational capacity to special operations. The Rangers proved American soldiers could match British commandos in courage and effectiveness when properly trained. The OSS demonstrated that intelligence and operations, combined, created synergies neither could achieve alone. American special forces were effective and influential, but they were building on foundations laid by others. The United States ranks fourth. Their special forces were effective, brave, and innovative, but they were built on the British model, not invented from scratch. Their contribution in the final 2 years of the war was immense, especially the OSS Jedburghs. But they were also prone to catastrophic failures like Cisterna when conventional commanders misunderstood how to use them. America was learning in World War II. They would perfect the art afterward, creating the most powerful special operations apparatus in history. But in the war itself, they were students, not masters. The Soviet Union's approach to special operations was so different from the Western model that some question whether it should even be called special forces at all. The Soviet paradox. The Soviet Union's special operations model breaks every Western rule. It wasn't surgical. It wasn't small-scale. It wasn't particularly concerned with individual skill or precision. Yet, by the criteria we've established, strategic impact, cost-effectiveness, and influence on the war's outcome, Soviet special forces achieved results that demand serious consideration. This ranking will be controversial. The Soviet model was morally murky, relying on the NKVD state security apparatus and mass partisan movements that blurred the line between soldier and civilian. The NKVD was responsible for internal repression, political purges, and forced deportations. Using its apparatus for military special operations raises ethical questions that Western militaries have never faced with their volunteer commando units. But if we judge effectiveness by measurable impact on the war, we cannot ignore what the Soviets accomplished. The question is whether effectiveness alone justifies a high ranking when the means were so different from Western models. The Soviet approach combined 3 elements: elite, NKVD, special tasks, units, deep penetration reconnaissance teams, and mass-organized partisan movements. These operated in coordination, creating a web of unconventional warfare that stretched across the entire Eastern Front. The scale dwarfed anything the Western Allies attempted. The NKVD People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs was responsible for state security, counterintelligence, and special operations. Within the NKVD, the Administration for Special Tasks conducted espionage, assassination, and sabotage. Its main special forces unit was Umsbon, the Independent Special Purpose Motorized Rifle Brigade. UMSBON was formed in October 1941 as German forces closed on Moscow. The situation was desperate. German panzers were within sight of the Kremlin's spires. The Red Army was reeling from catastrophic defeats. Stalin demanded unconventional options to strike back at German rear areas and gather intelligence. The NKVD responded by creating UMSBON from scratch in a matter of weeks. Its cadres were drawn from internal security forces, border guards, and, uniquely, civilian athletes. Over 800 athletes from Moscow boxers, wrestlers, skiers, linguists, radio operators, marksmen were recruited in the war's first months. These were men and women with exceptional physical capabilities and, often, language skills from international competitions. Why athletes? The NKVD reasoned that world-class athletes already possessed the physical conditioning, mental discipline, and competitive drive necessary for special operations. A boxer knew how to stay calm under pressure and deliver violence efficiently. A skier could traverse wilderness terrain that conventional soldiers couldn't. A linguist who had competed abroad could blend into occupied territory. The recruitment was unconventional, but it worked. By late 1941, UMSBON numbered over 10,000 personnel. This wasn't a small elite unit like the SAS. It was a brigade-sized force, but one trained for unconventional missions. The scale reflected Soviet operational thinking. If special operations were effective, why not create them in mass? These were not conventional soldiers. They were specialists in assassination, demolitions, intelligence gathering, and partisan organization. Their training emphasized independent operation behind enemy lines, survival in hostile territory, and ruthless execution of missions. UMSBON operatives parachuted into occupied territory, often with false identities and forged documents, to conduct sabotage or organize resistance. UMSBON units operated in multiple roles. Some conducted direct action raids on German rear areas, ammunition dumps, airfields, and headquarters. Others infiltrated occupied territory as partisans or undercover agents. Still others coordinated the actions of civilian resistance movements, providing leadership, training, radio communication with Moscow, and coordinating supply drops. The organizational structure was complex. UMSBON reported to the NKVD, but coordinated with the GRU Soviet military intelligence, which ran its own deep penetration reconnaissance units. Both organizations worked with the central headquarters of the partisan movement, established in May 1942, to organize the hundreds of thousands of irregular fighters operating behind German lines. This coordination was unprecedented. While the British SOE and military commandos operated under separate commands and sometimes competed for resources, the Soviet system, despite its bureaucratic rivalries, achieved strategic coordination. NKVD agents would identify targets, partisan units would conduct sabotage, and GRU reconnaissance would provide damage assessment and targeting updates. The system was ruthless and efficient. The scale was also unprecedented. While British SOE sent hundreds of agents into occupied Europe over the course of the war, the Soviets deployed thousands of NKVD operatives and tens of thousands of partisan organizers in the first 2 years alone. By mid-1943, Soviet special operations involved hundreds of thousands of fighters operating across occupied Soviet territory, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This wasn't a scalpel, it was a sledgehammer. The Western model prioritized small, elite teams conducting surgical strikes. The Soviet model deployed elite coordinators who directed mass forces in attritional campaigns. Both approaches worked, but they worked differently. Critics argue this disqualifies Soviet operations as special forces. The mass partisan armies weren't elite volunteers. Most received minimal training. They operated in large groups, not small teams. The NKVD's involvement taints the entire enterprise with the apparatus of state terror. But the numbers don't lie. Soviet special operations tied down hundreds of thousands of German troops, crippled logistics networks, gathered intelligence that altered major battles, and contributed directly to strategic victories. The effectiveness, measured by our criteria, demands recognition even if the methods challenge Western definitions. The Soviets fielded both surgical capability and mass attritional warfare simultaneously. Understanding how requires examining both sides of their model.